you're more than welcome to. And doing so, assuming you're not driving the car or doing some other stuff like that, doing so might make some of the discussion a little easier to follow if you have the images. And so for anyone who's listening to this after the fact, that tweet is the linked to this one, so you should be able to see them. If anybody has any questions about those, put that in the comment, please. And if we have comments about specific ones, we could, as we go through the discussion, if we're finding it too difficult or there's other problems, then I can see about creating my own document on Google Docs and doing a link for that. But I'm going to hold off on that to see if this link will be sufficient. So with that being said, we talked in the first part of this series about the assassination sort of in general terms, also coming at it from some different angles in terms of generational or age, and the psychological approaches to the whole event. And in this second part, we're gonna and sorry, in the first part, we also talked about some of the factual differences about what witnesses to the event saw or heard or what they said. We also talked over, like, assuming there was a conspiracy to assassinate Kennedy, who would the likely suspects be? What would their motives have been? So we started very big picture that way. And now, instead of doing this in a strictly chronological order, where we're going to talk about walking us through the event itself, what we're going to do is we're going to skip past that for the time being and move to the president has been shot. There's an autopsy is being conducted, and what was going on with that, because it gives you a frame for kind of looking backwards in time from the point of view of the shootings already taken place, to see, is there anything going on there that suggests suspicious activity, any kind of monkey business, or would contribute to the idea that there was a conspiracy to start with at the front end. And then in the next part, we're going to take a different angle. And eventually we're going to marry them all up. But we decided that taking a look at this part, the autopsy, would make sense as a second step in our process. So with that being said, King, I'm going to turn it over to you. As we've said before, I know very little about this part of the situation, so I think I'm going to be mostly in question mode. So I will let you have the floor.
Thank you. I talked Leslie into doing the autopsy next because, in my opinion, the autopsy and related activity by government agencies is the closest we have to a smoking gun in the Kennedy assassination. Um, it just to bring up everybody up to speed where we left after the first episode. We talked about a variety of witnesses who reported to the FBI or the Dallas police that they had seen others besides Oswald with a rifle. They had seen or heard gunshots coming from places other than the window and on the sixth floor of the school book depository where Oswald was allegedly housed. We also talked about Oswald's alibi, that he wasn't up there on the sixth floor when the shooting happened, and he had witnesses to corroborate that story, who worked at the school book depository. And we had evidence from eyewitnesses seeing people scurrying away from the site and getting into a getaway car, namely a light green Rambler station wagon with a luggage rack on top. All seemingly highly suspicious leads worthy of investigation, and potential investigation into those potential leads was essentially called off on orders of the new president of the United States that night, and the FBI and the Department of Justice a couple of days later, uh, in the form of a memo sent out by Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach, uh, stating that the policy from going forward would be to try to prove that Oswald alone killed the president. He had no accomplices, no conspirators. He did it by himself. And that's what the investigation would try to prove. Uh, Now we're going to talk about what happened immediately after the assassination and uh, focusing on the autopsy. I view the autopsy as looking for a Hollywood movie parallel. It's sort of Mission Impossible. Uh, the pathologist doing the autopsy, which was done in Bethesda, Maryland, at a Navy hospital, they were given the mission, but not if they choose to accept. They were ordered. They were military officers ordered to do the autopsy. They did it in the presence of a morgue full of high ranking military officers, plus a couple of FBI agents and a handful of Secret Service agents. But by and large, this was a military operation witnessed by high ranking officers, including a couple of flag officers. Um, and then at the end of the autopsy, everybody in attendance was given an order and required to sign a document acknowledging that they would not speak of what they saw and what they heard during the autopsy under pain of court martial, as if this were a top secret uh, information that they had observed. Something top secret happened, and they weren't allowed to talk about it for a period of, some were told 15 years, others were told 20. Uh, and they would be prosecuted or court-martialed if they let on what happened uh, at the autopsy. Why was the autopsy done in Bethesda? It was done that night, the night of November 22nd. They officially began at 8 o'clock p.m. and finished sometime after 11 o'clock, the official part. Uh, at the time the autopsy was conducted, Oswald was in custody in Dallas. He would be charged with murdering the president that night, uh, later that night.
He'd
So,
also killed a police officer in
and
the
he
interim.
and he was charged with killing a police officer as well, and and he was, since killing a president was not a federal crime at the time. His only uh, criminal risk was under Texas law, and he was charged with murder under Texas law. Uh, so the autopsy was very much a critical piece of evidence, would be a critical piece of evidence in his prosecution because he hadn't been killed yet. Uh, Under Texas law, the coroner of Dallas County was required to do the autopsy. And the coroner showed up at Parkland Hospital uh, when Kennedy passed away and announced he was going to take the body and conduct an autopsy under Texas law, whereupon the Secret Service agents um, had the body placed in a ornate bronze casket put onto a wheeled gurney cart, and they started wheeling the body out of the hospital. The coroner stood in the way, whereupon the Secret Service agents showed their weapons and threatened to pull him if he didn't get out of the way. So he did step back. They almost had uh, a real tug of war at the time. He did step back under protest, and they hauled the body out, put it into the back of a uh, private hearse, drove it to Love Field, where Air Force One was parked, loaded the casket up onto the plane, and they were later joined by the president, his aides, and the Kennedy party. All flew back to Washington on um, Air Force One. You can, if you're curious, you can hear a tape record, lengthy tape recording of the conversation that and conversations that happened on Air Force One, going back to D.C. Uh, the autopsy was originally scheduled for uh, Walter Reed Hospital, which is about 10-minute drive or less from Bethesda, the Bethesda Hospital. And Walter Reed was known at the time for having probably the best pathology department in the military. And but the 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 Secret Service agent Bain is his name, talking to Air Force One out of the White House, uh, vetoed that and said, "We're going to do it at Bethesda. Uh, we'll have helicopter meet the airplane when it lands at Andrews Air Force Base. That helicopters will take the new president and all of the passengers on the plane back to the White House, and we will fly the body, accompanied by Secret Service agents, from Andrews Air Force to Bethesda for the autopsy." Uh, those plans
Now
got,
let me ask you
yeah,
this. They were planning to fly his body separate in a separate helicopter to
yes,
Bethesda,
yeah,
because for
yeah,
folks that don't know, Andrews Air Force Base is on one side of DC and the Bethesda Naval Medical Center is on the other side of DC. So
yeah,
you would have to get there effectively by car. You would have to drive around the Beltway if you didn't want to navigate your way through the city.
yeah. Well, they ended up navigating their way through the city,
Mm-hmm.
and that happened because shortly before they arrived at Andrews, Jackie Kennedy, the widow, uh, announced she was going to accompany the body to the morgue, uh, where they were going to do the autopsy. She didn't want to leave him, so they made a last minute switch. They flew everybody back to the White House except for Jackie and uh, a military aide and some Secret Service agents, uh, who, instead of flying the casket and body from Andrews to Bethesda, they uh, put put the casket into the back of a Navy U.S. Navy ambulance, light gray colored ambulance that had been ordered to meet the airplane when it landed, because there was some rumor about that Lyndon Johnson had had another heart attack. So they wanted the ambulance there in case he was not feeling well. Uh, he didn't need it. So they took that ambulance and they basically had a motorcade, uh, led by the ambulance and a couple other uh, vehicles through D.C. The Air Force One landed about little after 6, and the motorcade arrived at um, Bethesda of just a couple minutes before 7 o'clock. Uh, there was a helicopter that flew the members of an honor guard, a casket team, um, with all dressed in dress uniforms. Their job was to uh, uh, carry the casket in wherever it was going, and ultimately, after the morticians were through, uh, take the casket to the White House, where it would lay in state, and then later lay in state at the Capitol. Uh, the these these were representatives, military representatives of each of the services, including the Coast Guard. They took a helicopter to Bethesda uh, and were there when uh, the motorcade arrived. The autopsy was conducted by, and I've got more. I've got a lot more to say about th- that journey, but you need to hear about the autopsy first. The three pathologists conducted the autopsy. A Dr. Humes was the lead. Dr. Boswell assisted him, and they were joined about halfway in to the autopsy by Dr. Fink. Uh, Boswell and Humes were Navy commanders. Fink was an air, I mean, a Army uh, captain, I believe. Uh, of the three, only Fink had any uh, bullet wound autopsy experience. He was a board certified forensic pathologist, but he'd only held that for 2 years, and he hadn't actually performed autopsies. He had more of a desk job. Uh, Humes and Boswell were pathologists by trade, but had but weren't experienced, actually had no experience in doing bullet wound autopsy. I think in his testimony before the Warren Commission, Fink explained that uh, one major difference is the forensic pathologist, part of their training is to recognize the requirements of the legal requirements that they would need to present to a jury in a criminal case. Uh, and so that, because that's one of the primary purposes in a gunshot wound case, is to help the prosecution uh, present uh, the criminal case to a jury and against the accused. Uh, so basically, they had their pick of pathologists all over the East Coast. In fact, a couple of them had their bags packed. One of the leading pathologists was had reserved the room and has his equipment laid out uh, at Walter Reed. But the Secret Service, uh, in conversation with a couple of high-ranking Navy officers, uh, vetoed those potential plans and took the body to the morgue at
Let
Bethesda.
me ask you this question. Um, is there anything that indicates if Johnson had any contribution to these decisions? Like, who is making the decision to do
The
all this?
the lead Secret Service agent at the Whi- of the at the in the White House, in the White House
Mhm.
Situation Room at the
Okay.
time. Uh, Johnson was on the phone the entire time talking to various people. We have some of the we have a few things, a few snippets of his conversations, but not very many. He Not all of his calls were recorded.
So, because we talked
So
last
we
time
don't know.
about is potentially one of the people who allegedly would have wanted Kennedy killed, but you
Right.
would think if that were true and he wanted to monkey with the autopsy, you'd think he'd be more involved with trying to control that.
And he may have been. We don't know. We don't have. All we do know is that he was on the phone talking to a variety of people, uh, but those calls are not recorded. Recordings we do have a good bit of uh, talk between Secret Service and military officers, uh, including in the background, you can hear people talk about a black Cadillac hearse or a private Cadillac hearse, which will come into play towards the end of my presentation. But I'll just give you a teaser right now. Let's get to uh, the autopsy itself. The conclusion of the autopsy was that Kennedy was hit by two bullets from the rear. One bullet went in at the base of the back of his neck and came out the front of his neck, right below the Adam's apple. Uh, the second bullet went into the back of his head through the occipital bone. Let me give you a little anatomy lesson right now. Um, there's the bones in the head. You can start with the occipital. If you put your forefinger in the middle of your head on the back and raise it up an inch or so, that's the tip of a triangle, and the base of the triangle is across the bottom of your head before it hits the spinal, your vertebrae in your neck. So the base of the triangle runs horizontally down across the bottom of the skull and goes up to the pointed end of that triangle. That's the occipital. Above it, on either side, right and left of the occipital, are the parietal bones, right and left. They're joined together at the top by a suture that runs uh, from back to front. Uh, and the parietal bones go forward to a point just in front of your ears where they join with the frontal bones, which are the uh, two skull bones that make up your forehead and the and connect back to the parietal bones. And then the last bones are the temporal bones, which begin right behind your ears. That they're thin and they kind of curve around and run through the temple area. This gunshot, the autopsy found, came in the kind of the lower half of the occipital. It it then and it came out uh, in the top right of the skull, uh, mostly on the parietal bone, but fracturing bones in front of that as well, and it exploded out on the top right of the skull in front of the president's ear. Uh, one one uh, one fundamental thing about gunshot wounds is when a bullet enters the body, it normally makes a small hole, and then when it comes out the other side, the exit wound will be larger and sometimes much larger than the entry. And the autopsist found that the entrance on the back of the lower part of the skull was small, maybe 6 millimeters diameter, and it came out and made a giant hole on the top right of his skull, blowing out and fracturing uh, just about everything in the skull as it exited.
And when you're saying the right, are the right his right
His
or the
right,
right as we're
his
looking at his
his
skull
right,
face on? His right.
his right,
Okay.
his right. Because he was, even though the shot came from the rear at the time it hit him, uh, the Zapruder film shows that his head was kind of tilted forward
Mm,
a little bit.
mm.
Uh, uh, so that was the conclusion. I can't let that just lay there.
Well, let me ask you. You described the path of the one bullet. Were you going to do the other one too, or?
The other bullet, yeah, was through the base of the neck in the back and came out right the front of his throat, right around the Adam's apple,
Oh,
just
I
below
see. Okay,
below the Adam's apple.
I'm with you.
That's the so-called magic bullet that the Warren Commission found went on to hit Governor Connolly in the back right, the shoulder part of his back, came out his chest, went into it fractured a rib as it went through his chest, then hit him in the wrist, smashed his the radius bone in his right wrist, and then went left and landed and finally embedded itself in his left thigh. Uh, so it caused 7 wounds and and had almost no damage to it. Uh, that's a big controversy about the Warren Commission findings. But these guys in Bethesda didn't deal with Connolly's wounds. All they dealt with was the president's, and they said that bullet went in the base of his neck, came out his throat, uh, and, and the fatal injury was the one to the back of the head. Uh, let me tell you what the treating doctors. Let's go back to Parkland Hospital. You had a team of surgeons and other specialists who tried to save his life. Uh, that he was brought to Parkland, the emergency room at Parkland, uh, immediately, and they described something totally different from what the autopsy found. All of them describe a large gaping wound in the back right of Kennedy's skull, uh, mostly in the occipital region, but extending up in the right parietal bone as well. It was an avulsive. That means it looked like it was exploded from inside out, uh, with bones and scalp tissue kind of blown out from the inside. It's between 3.5 and 5.5 inches. It was sort of trapezoidal, but a wound, a gaping wound that you could put your fist in or a baseball in, with brain tissue extruding out of it, and a hole big enough you could look down in it and see missing brain. Now, let me get you another anatomy lesson. There, the brain has two major components: the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Cerebrum is what you think of when you think of a brain, the whitish gray, uh, with the ridges, and a brain looks like a brain. That looks like a brain when you think of a brain. Cerebellum is an organ beneath that brain on the back. It kind of wraps around the brain stem. It's has a totally different look, texture, and color than the cerebrum, uh, and performs a different function. Uh, if you do a cross section of the cerebellum, you'll get something that kind of looks like a cross section of cauliflower. It's totally different looking and different texture than the cerebrum. Well, these doctors looked down into that hole. They saw missing cerebrum and cerebellum. Uh, and here's some quotes. Dr. Peters, I noticed there's a large defect in the occiput. That's the occipital. Uh, uh, Dr. Perry, I looked in the head wound briefly, leaning over the table, noticed the parietal and occipital head wound was largely avulsive. That means exploding from the inside. There was visible brain tissue, and I saw some cerebellum. Uh, Dr. Crenshaw described a chunk of the cerebellum hanging by a thread of tissue and then falling out onto the table. Uh, Dr. McClellan stood at the top of the gurney, above. What in the world is that? What? I've got something going on with my.
Is that your computer talking
That's I don't know what's talking. That's something on my.
on your phone?
It could be my phone. Or, that's.
Well, mute yourself for a second.
Hold on, let me find it.
Yeah, mute yourself and then fix that. While King is fixing his technical problem there, I was curious about this, so I jumped on the Google machine to see when was the Beltway around DC created, and so the final section opened to the public in '64, and the final section, I'm just a cursory look I'm taking here, looks to me like it was the section in Maryland on the eastern side of the city, the northeast part of the Beltway. So the section running from Andrews Air Force Base to Bethesda Naval Base in late 63, they would have probably had to have taken what we would have called the long way around. So going south down through Alexandria and Arlington and all of that, across the Woodrow Wilson and back up to um, Bethesda in Maryland on the other side of DC. So I'm interested to hear what King's going to say here in a little while about what route did they take. So it appears to
And
me that they could not have taken the Beltway
no,
going north, but they
I
could have
found what was
south.
making. I found what was making the noise. It
Okay.
it it's. I think they took the most direct route through.
The
Uh,
most direct route would have
DC.
been to drive through the city at that
That's it.
time. Yeah.
Right, and it took them about oh 45 minutes or so,
Okay.
maybe a little longer. Um,
That sounds about right. At that time of night, there would have been less traffic, and at that back
right.
then, less than now. So that
Yeah.
seems reasonable to me.
Yeah.
But okay, so
Okay.
picking
So
back up where
yeah,
you were.
Dr. McClellan. He stood over uh, Kennedy's head. He was helping Dr. Peary install a tracheotomy, and he was holding leaning over Kennedy's head and holding a retractor uh, to assist Perry doing the tracheotomy in the throat. And he said he was looking. His face was 12 to 18 inches from the gaping wound. I was in a position that I could very closely examine the head wound. The right rear posterior portion of the skull had been extremely blasted. It had been shattered, apparently by the force of the shot. so that the parietal bone was protruded up through the scalp, seemed to be fractured almost along its right anterior half, that's the front half, as well as some occipital in its lateral half, and sprung open the bones. You could actually look down into the skull cavity itself and see that probably a third or so, at least, of the brain tissue, the posterior cerebellar tissue, and some of the cerebral tissue and some of the cerebellar tissue had been blasted out. There was about a 7 centimeter hole in that area. Quite a bit of brain was missing, and as I was looking at it, a fairly large portion of the cerebellum fell out of the skull. There was already some brain there, but during the tracheotomy, more fell out, and there was clearly cerebellum. Uh, Dr. Kemp Clark then came in to look. He was the director of neurosurgery for the hospital, which was a teaching hospital. He was the director of neurosurgery for the Southwest Texas Medical School. The man was highly credentialed, well respected. He went around and looked at the wound, and I'm reading from his uh, from what he told the press later that afternoon. He said there was a large gaping wound in the right posterior part with cerebral and cerebellar tissue being damaged and exposed. I told the press it could be an exit wound, but I felt it was more of a tangential wound where the bullet comes in at an oblique angle. Uh, and so it hits more bone than a straight on shot. And therefore it sheds a whole lot more energy, striking the brain a more powerful blow. So he these every one of these doctors wrote up their findings and what they observed that afternoon. And I said, Dr. Clark, who signed the death certificate, uh, reported to the press that they were looking at either an exit wound or a tangential wound that came in from the side obliquely, the exact opposite of what the autopsy pathologist found. So let's go to I'm going to describe for you the autopsy report. And they give the game away. They started off with description of what they were told happened in Dealey Plaza. Uh, well, they talk about the limousine traveling at a slow rate of speed. 3 shots were heard. President fell forward, bleeding from the head. Witnesses saw a rifle barrel disappearing into a window on an upper floor of the Texas School Book Depository. Uh, it, then they said after we finished the autopsy, we talked to Dr. Perry, who had performed the tracheotomy on the throat. And Dr. Perry noted there was a massive wound in the head and a second, much smaller wound in the low anterior, the front of the neck. Uh, they don't say where on the head, they just said a massive wound in the head and a low wound, a wound in the front of the throat. They claim that during the autopsy, they did not know about that throat wound because it was masked by or obscured by a 7-inch wide tracheotomy opening, a big gash. If you look at that link to the autopsy photos, you'll see a photo of President Kennedy with a death stare, and you'll see the tracheotomy wound in his throat that looks to have been surgically altered. Uh, It's the Parkland doctors have testified that the tracheotomy incision that Dr. Perry had made was no more than an inch to inch and a half wide, and this one is more than double that. Uh, anyway, they say because of the size of that wound, they didn't know there was a gunshot wound coming out the throat. So th- with that, they were able to conclude that the bullet in the back of the base of the neck had to have come out of that front shot, the front wound in the throat. Now let's go to what they say they found with the head. Uh, they found a wound, a gaping wound with missing bone that starts in the back of the head and runs along the top of the head where the hair, if you've parted your hair on the right, along that ridge, all the way almost to the forehead above the right eye. And that in a drawing that one of them made, uh, the length of that long gaping wound was 19 centimeters, uh, which comes to what about 8 inches, almost 8 inches, running all the way along lengthwise along the top of the head. But they describe nothing on. There's no mention of a gaping wound on the right rear of Kennedy's head behind his right ear, where all of the Parkland doctors said they saw a gaping wound with brain tissue falling out of it. Uh,
So, what do you make of that?
I think it's fraud. I think and I'll get to why I say that.
On the part of
Um,
the autopsy
from
examiners,
part of the autopsy, yes, it's a cover up. There, my theory and the theory of most uh, people who've looked at it is that their orders were to support the theory that Oswald alone was the sole shooter, and that there was no evidence of any bullets hitting Kennedy from any other direction.
which obviously, if the forensics had showed that he was struck by from more than one direction, that theory wouldn't have held up.
Correct. And
Now, so the autopsy report is showing two entrance wounds and two exit wounds.
yes, they're vague about the exit wound in the head.
Mm-hmm.
They said the head is so blasted out
Mm-hmm.
that you couldn't see it. The only reason they could not find an exit per se in the head until they looked at the edges of a couple of bone fragments that were brought to the morgue later that evening by Secret Service, and each of those had little scalloped edges broken out,
Mm-hmm.
and from those scalloped edges, you can tell they were the edge of an exit wound.
Where
They
the
say
projectile had been.
correct,
Okay.
correct.
And did they
Now,
have the so-called Harper fragment?
did not
They did not.
did not
Okay.
know did not know they they claimed that they had enough fragments to basically fill up most of the hole on the top right of the skull, uh, just with a few places still missing.
Mm-hmm.
But since there was no hole in the back of the skull. uh, they didn't need the Harper fragment, I guess.
Right.
Uh, They a little bit about ballistics and forensics. The Oswald rifle was Italian carbine from World War II. It shot full metal jacketed bullets. A full metal jacketed bullet is one where the lead is completely encased in a metal jacket. These were uh, a copper alloy jacket, completely covering the bullet, and those tend not to fragment when very much when they strike the body. Um, they tend to come in one side and go out the other. It'll be deformed, or maybe a piece or two may break off, but they're designed not to either expand and make the wound a great deal larger, like a dum dum bullet might do, nor are they designed to fragment into scores of very small pieces that would cause more damage but be less likely to pass all the way through. Uh, the kind that tend to fragment are things like hunting rounds, where there's the tips of the bullets are soft points. There's no hard metal jacket surrounding it that keeps it from breaking into pieces. The uh, the autopsy report says that they found two small pieces of bullets, one in the rear of the skull, and the other one in the orbit of the right eye. And they retrieved those with forceps. That's the only fragments they say they retrieved. Uh, they removed the brain, moved the organs, and they finished the autopsy uh, later. Uh, you, by way of explanation, you can't completely examine the brain without fixing it in formalin first and getting it hardened up a little bit. Uh, it's just too soft and malleable otherwise. So you have to fix it. And if you use, there's two ways to fix it. One is infusion by injecting the formaldehyde solution into the arteries, uh, as well as soak it in the solution. The other is just to soak it. The first way you can do the remaining brain exam within 3-4 days of the autopsy. The second way, you need to wait at least a week or two before it's firm enough to examine. Uh, anyway, there's a supplemental report on the brain exam. Let me find my notes here. The supplemental report says that they examined the brain. They did not section it, which is critical here because the only way to trace a bullet's path through the brain is by doing sections. That's like slicing it like a bread loaf or a pie to be able to trace the path of a bullet. They did not do that because they wanted to preserve it. Not sure why, but they just to preserve the specimen, they didn't do the sections. Uh, the report says that all three pathologists did the brain exam. They had a Navy photographer uh, there. Dr. Fink, the Army pathologist, testified that he got a call from Dr. Humes on the 29th of November. That would be a week after the assassination, uh, asking him to come down and meet him at the morgue so they could do the brain exam. Uh, and present were Doctors Humes, Boswell, and Fink, the Navy photographer, and maybe one other assistant. Fink wasn't quite sure. Fink asked Humes, "Can we get a neurological specialist to come help us and look at this?" And he was told no. So the three of them did it. Uh, the best the ARRB investigators could tell, uh, it was performed sometime between the 29th of November and December 2nd, which was the day some small uh, specimens were given to the lab there at Bethesda um, to do tests on. Uh, and that in the written report, they found damage to the brain along the top right portion of the cerebrum. There's no mention of a lower back wound, no mention of any damage to the cerebellum. The photographs of the brain in the archives show no damage to the cerebellum and no damage to the back lower part, the part of the brain that the Parkland doctors said they saw drop out onto the table. The brain, according to the autopsy report, weighed 1,500 grams. Uh, that's a key indicator here. The average, the weight of an average male brain, if my memory serves me, is like 1,340 grams. You can add maybe 8 to 10% for the the fixation solution. Uh, that still puts the brain well above average, and but you've got in this case witness, medical witness after medical witness after medical witness, this, including assistants and technicians at the autopsy who saw the brain when it was removed, all say that Kennedy's brain was missing anywhere from a third to a half of its mass when they took it out of his head. Yet this brain, in the photographs and by weight, was intact with obvious damage around the upper right crown of the head, uh, as described in the autopsy report.
Kind of seems like that would be a sloppy way of doing a conspiracy because,
Yes.
you know, there were how many witnesses saw him get shot in the head, right? Fragments
Well,
of his skull flew off and were found in the road. So,
the Warren report bought it hook, line, and sinker. Uh, Although four of the members, as I explained last time, uh, uh, didn't buy it. But the what happened was all the autopsy report, all of the photographs, and all of the X-rays were put under seal, uh, and the House Special Committee on Assassinations, the HSCA, which was formed in the around the time of the Church Committee hearings in the late 1970s, This so much controversy had by then arisen about the Warren Commission and its shoddy work. Uh, they decided to take another look at it. They 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 had a team of forensic pathologists who looked at the autopsy X-rays and photos, and they said based on those, they agreed with the autopsy findings, except they moved the entry point of the bullet from the rear up a little over 4 inches. So instead of coming in to his at his lower back of his head, now they've got the bullet coming in uh, on the upper third of the head from behind and coming out around the same place. Uh, I think they figured out that a bullet shot from the sixth floor of a building hitting Kennedy, even if his head was at a slight angle, hitting Kennedy in the lower part of his back of his head, that if it came out the other side, it would blow out his face. Uh, so they had to move that bullet up. Uh, another reason they did it is uh, the X-rays had fragments, showed fragments, and Dr. Humes, during the autopsy, according to testimony, had counted out at least 40 particles that he saw on the X-rays. Counted them 1, 2, 3, 4, that way. Uh, which is also significant because remember I explained how a soft pointed bullet will tend to fragment as it goes through the skull, whereas the full metal jacketed bullet does not. Well, here you've got 40 particles of bullets that he sees on the X-ray, but he only pulls out, he says, only two metal fragments. And the the brain that they autopsied had zero fragments. They found some bone fragments in it, but no metal fragments at all. Uh, so the 40 particles seem to have disappeared. But you can look on the x ray from the side, and you can see a handful of fragments towards the top of the skull. Uh, there's two medical professionals who have rendered written books and written reports, and they say you what you can't see from the public record is what those X-rays look like act, that are in the archives. In the public realm, all you have are copies that the HSCA made in 1978 or so. And these are enhanced versions of the x rays, which means merely that they have jacked up the contrast of the x rays so that everything that's even lighter gray turns white, and anything that's darker gray turns black, with little in between. That process obscures most of the metal fragments, but you go there and look at the originals, according to Dr. Chesser. He has produced a the X-ray that is in the public domain and has uh, basically drew on it, showing where all the fragments are. It's been described as a looking like the Milky Way or the a snowstorm of really small metal fragments that extend from the front of the head to the rear of the head, uh, up above like starting around the hairline above his eyebrow and going backwards uh, towards the back and in a cone shape pattern that is narrow near the forehead and then getting wider as it extends back. That is typical of a fragmented bullet pattern made by a frangible bullet. Once it fragments upon hitting the skull, the what happens is the larger pieces, larger fragments tend to go further. The light, smaller fragments congregate closer to the entrance, and that's how you can tell where the entrance is and which direction the bullet was coming from. Because the larger ones, since they have higher mass, have a greater kinetic energy and go through the brain further. Uh, and these doctors Mantic and Chesser said this is typical of a bullet that has entered his forehead uh, right around the hairline on the right side and blasting through the skull towards the rear. So that's one entrance, one bullet that the autopsy pathologist missed. The other one they missed was as Dr. Clark in Parkland described, a tangential uh, strike that hit Kennedy right behind, right above, or right behind his right ear, and blasted out the right rear of his head. Uh, and I'll tell you how they get there in a minute. The
Before
what
we
they
do that, so let's talk about the number of bullets. Um, the Warren Commission says 3 shots, but only two hit Kennedy, and the first one missed.
Yeah, the first one missed. If the Warren Commission, well, first it did miss. Question maybe who shot it, because it it traveled about 35 feet over the top of Kennedy's head and landed 25, 28 feet to the left. It missed the street. No, it missed the head, it missed the limo, it missed the street and hit a street, one street over, hit the curb, and then glanced off and hit a bystander by the name of Tag. Uh, so this great shot, Oswald, uh, didn't come within 25 feet of Kennedy's head with his first shot.
Okay, so but I'm documenting like who said what. So the Warren Commission said 3 shots, first shot missed.
First shot missed. Second shot hit Kennedy, passed through Kennedy, and hit Connolly. Uh, now Connolly
Well, that's where I was
disagrees
going with it. So, but stick with the Warren
vigorously.
Commission first. So, Warren Commission says the first shot missed, second shot hit Kennedy, and then hit Connolly.
Kennedy in the head, in the head. Third shot hit Kennedy, and
Right,
in his head,
right.
and came out. There two bullet fragments landed in the front of the limo, and they pulled two out of Kennedy's skull, and the 40 particles that were identified during the autopsy seems to have disappeared.
Now, Connolly swore from the start to the finish that there were 3 shots.
He says no. He says Kennedy got hit by a different. He did not. He Connolly did not get hit with the same bullet that hit Kennedy in the neck. He said that he heard a shot from behind.
Right.
He turned his head to the right and then was turning back to the left when he got hit without another sound. Bullets travel supersonic speed, so you get hit without hearing the shot. He said that's what happened to him. And according to the Zapruder film, he doesn't react to a bullet strike until a second, 1.5 seconds after Kennedy has already reacted to something hitting him in the throat.
Right.
So,
Yes, I agree with that. I've seen that film so many times. So, but
yeah,
I'm just saying, Connolly agrees that there were three shots.
he's not sure about three shots. He knows that the shot that hit him was not the shot that hit Kennedy in the
Okay,
throat.
well, I've seen his interviews. He clearly says there were three shots. He's not,
He,
he doesn't say which ones, the number he thinks he was hit with, right? But he's clear that there are three, because some people argue that there were only two, and Connolly maintained his whole life that there were three
yeah,
shots.
yeah.
So, okay. Um,
So
the question then is, okay, how did the does the autopsy account for how many shots? It kind of doesn't, right?
it no, it yeah, it starts with the presumption there were three. That in on the first page, Oswald shot. uh,
Are you talking about the Warren Commission, or are you talking about the
I'm talking
autopsy?
about the autopsy report.
Okay, this was my question: is did the
Yeah,
autopsy comment on how many shots there were?
no, no, it just has it concludes there were two bullet wounds in Kennedy's body.
Right. Okay. All right. So,
So uh, before I get to what's wrong with the photos and the
mm,
X-rays,
yeah.
there's a lot, but and that's where that that's exhibit number one on proof of fraud. Before you get there, um, there's discrepancies in what the underlying documents say. Uh, there's a what they call a face sheet,
Mm,
which has a diagram of a person, you know, schematic sketch
right. Of a human face. Yep.
of a human body, and the wound, they mark where the wound that came in Kennedy's back, the lower part of his neck is, and the it's not, it doesn't, they don't mark it the base of the neck. It's marked down about 5 inches from Kennedy, from the where the collar of Kennedy's shirt would be. So it's in the upper back on the right side, even with his shoulder blade. Uh,
Okay.
Doctor Kennedy had a personal surgeon who was a Navy admiral, Admiral Berkeley, uh, who had to fill out a death certificate in D.C. so they could do the autopsy. And in that on that death certificate, he writes that the back wound came in at the level of the third thoracic vertebra,
Okay.
which is you've got 12 thoracic vertebrae and I think 7 cervical vertebrae. The cervical are your neck bones. The thoracic are your upper back bones down before you get to your lower back. They're they're each thoracic vertebra has indirectly attached to it a rib on each side. So you think of your ribs connected to your thoracic vertebra. And so thoracic vertebra number three, T3, would be the third rib down. Uh, there's another doctor who was at the autopsy, the radiologist, Dr. Ebersol. He said it was more like T4. So whether it's that bullet it didn't hit a rib. So if it came in next to a thoracic vertebra, it would have to go between ribs. So it's either coming in between T3 and T4 or T2 and T3. In either event, that bullet is coming in to the chest area,
Right.
upper chest, between ribs. And if you just think of it, your own body, to get to the front of your throat, that bullet's got to go up. It uh, Otherwise it's coming out the front of your chest or hitting your breastplate or the front side of a rib. Uh, at the autopsy, eyewitnesses, some who testified to both the HSCA and the AARB, described the pathologist getting all concerned because they couldn't find where that bullet went. They saw it going in, and they said Dr. Humes, the lead pathologist, poked his finger into it and announced to all those present that it was best he could tell, the bullet's path was at about between a 45 and a 60-degree angle downward, which it would be coming from a tall building. So if it's hitting between ribs going on a downward path, that's not going to go up to your throat. Uh, then they said he the path went so far he couldn't get any further. So Dr. Fink tried to use a metal flexible probe uh, to trace it,
Mm-hmm.
and they again they conjectured it went through his chest. Then they learned that a bullet was found on the stretcher at Parkland. It would be the so-called magic bullet. So they surmised that bullet must have fallen out of his back during external heart massage
Right, or his clothes. Mm-hmm.
in
Yeah.
the ER.
Yeah.
That's the only explanation they could come up with at the time as to what happened to that bullet that had gone into his back, uh, uh, either between T3 and T4 or between T2 and T3. Nobody thought that it might have gone upwards and out the throat. When they Fortunately, we have another autopsy report.
Well,
Most people don't.
you cut out there for a second, King. You said fortune before you said
Fortunately,
yeah.
we have another autopsy report.
Okay.
Most people don't know this. Um, FBI Director Hoover, recognizing this would be a critical piece of evidence against Oswald, he wanted to maintain chain of custody. So he sent two FBI agents out of their Baltimore office, agents Seibert and O'Neill, and they wrote up a 302, Form 302, describing everything they saw during the autopsy.
Mm.
And they start off in the first full paragraph describing uh, Kennedy's body being put up on the um, table. It was apparent that a tracheotomy had been performed, and I'll quote, as well as surgery of the head area, namely in the top of the skull. And the
Surgery?
surgery. Now, the only surgery that the Parkland people had done was a tracheotomy, and they made two incisions on the front of his chest to insert tubes in case the lungs had collapsed. Uh, that's the only surgery they had done. They had not touched his head. But they said,
By
and
that, by the word surgery, what do you take that to mean? Evidence of like
they
suturing or
no incisions,
incision? Okay.
incisions, and uh, and other witnesses who saw it, uh, cutting of skull bone,
Okay.
and this happened before the autopsy began because the body arrived at the morgue at 6:35. The formal autopsy began at 8. They There was a kind of a shell game played with the body and the casket. The body actually arrived at the morgue at 6:35 in a gray metal standard military shipping casket, the kind that they would send bodies back from Vietnam in. It's not designed to display during a funeral, so you don't have a, a, a way to open up the top half.
Right.
Uh, it's just one long, and it's cheap,
Right.
uh,
It's a functional item. Right.
functional item. And you got a handful of witnesses who watched the body being taken out, brought in, and taken out of a gray metal military shipping casket and put up on the table in the morgue. And those two of those same people, they started with X-rays, but two people, one X-ray technician and another a mortician. Uh, the body arrived, by the way, not in the gray Navy ambulance, but in a black Cadillac hearse, just like they described on Air Force One. Uh, they saw and testified that they saw the pathologist, Humes, make incisions at the top of the head and pull out a bone saw to start sewing, and started sewing on the skull bone at the top of his head. One of the mortician, his name is Tom Robinson, he was shown photographs. There's a photograph of the back of Kennedy's head that the pathologist claimed shows where the entrance wound was at the back of the head, a small 6 millimeter diameter entrance wound. Other than that, there's no apparent damage at all anywhere on the back of the head. There's no gaping hole, no brains coming out, nothing like that. It's totally untouched. And Robinson says that's not the way it looked. He saw the big gaping hole. He said the bullet did that. And they said, what about this other photo? And it's this both of these photos are in that link. There's a photo of the back of the head, not a photo or maybe a sketch of the photo of the back of the head, but there's also a couple photos from the top, from the showing exposed brain matter, uh, the top right of the head, all the way front to back. They asked him about that, and he says, "That's what the doctors did. That's not what the bullet did," pointing to the top of his head. Um, the the 302, the FBI 302, confirms that Boswell did announce that there were uh, 40, at least 40 different uh, fragments in the in the skull. He said they took out some of them and but left a lot behind, still in the skull. They let's see. I'll read it. Just the chief pathologist advised. That's what he said out loud. There were approximately 40 particles of disintegrated bullet and smudges, indicating that the projectile had fragmentized while passing through the skull region. That is not a description of a full metal jacket bullet. Uh,
Right. It seems inconsistent with the whole idea that the point of that kind of a round is for it to be able to have to keep going.
Correct. Uh, it also describes the opening. Uh, a bullet hole which was below the shoulders, not in the base of his neck, but below the shoulders, 2 inches to the right of the middle line of the spinal column. This opening was probed by Dr. Humes with a finger.
Are you talking about still talking about the 302 here? I'm sorry, you said it
Yes,
described.
this is the 302. At which point it was determined that the trajectory of the missile entering at this point had entered at a downward position of 45 to 60 degrees. Further probing, that would be with the metal probe, determined that the distance traveled by this missile was a short distance, inasmuch as the end of the opening could be felt with the finger. Uh, they took X-rays to see if they could find out where that bullet went, and but they were at a loss to explain why they could find no bullets. That's when they found out about the bullet on the stretcher. Uh, The one of the witnesses to all this was the military corpsman who was sort of in charge for the day. His name is Dennis David. He described being he did not attend the autopsy, but he did. He was there to let them in, and he described the gray metal casket at 6:35 p.m. Uh, he a service agent grabbed him and wanted him to type up a receipt for bullet fragments. And the agent had a glass vial with four four relatively large fragments. He said there were four of them, and combined they probably made up at least one full bullet and part of a second one. Uh, he typed up a receipt uh, to be signed. The and the agent let him actually hold the fragments when he asked. Uh, they put him back in the vial. He gave the receipt that he had typed up. The Secret Service guy said, "You can't tell anybody about this. Give me your typewriter ribbon." So he had to. He,
That's old school.
yeah, he took the typewriter ribbon, took all the copies he had made, and the original. Um, those fragments it never showed up in the official record. Uh, Robinson, the mortician, said they spent the longest time pulling as many of the 40 fragments as they could out of the brain. Couldn't get them all, but he said they used a forceps to take these out, and they filled up a a, a vial with at least 10 different additional fragments. Those also disappeared and never made it into the record, nor are they mentioned in the autopsy report. Now let's go to the photos. Uh, oh, by the way, And Seibert also described looking at the X-rays. He says, I recall the X-rays of the head being shown in the room. The head X-ray had many flecks like the Milky Way. Part of the bullet had fragmented or disintegrated. A lot of the metal fragments were tiny, and those that were removed from the body were put in a little jar with a black top. Before they left the morgue, we signed a receipt for the metal fragments. Uh, a receipt was prepared by someone else and typed up by a naval foreman. That would be Dennis David that I
Hmm.
described.
Right.
That was Seibert's sworn testimony I just read. So the there's some hanky panky going on with this, as you can see, and it got worse, not better. Uh, I described the photograph that doesn't show any damage to the back of the head. One of the witnesses said they spent a little time trying to pull flaps of skin back to cover wounds, uh, but there was still a gap. You still had that wound was big enough you couldn't cover it all up. Uh, Dr. Mantic, David Mantic, is what I'll say the contrary expert to the Warren Commission here. He has a PhD in physics and was teaching physics as a professor in Michigan, I think University of Michigan, when he decided to go to medical school. And he ended up being not only a PhD in physics, but also uh, a specialist in radiology oncology. And he got interested in something, got him interested in the Kennedy assassination. And with his credentials, he was allowed to get into the archives and look at the original photographs and the original x-rays. And when the protocol for doing medical photography, the photographer takes pairs of photos with uh, each one from a slightly different aspect, so you can view them stereoscopically, and you can see more that way. Uh, so Mantic looked at the the back of the head photos with a stereo viewer,
Hmm.
and he says right in the middle of the head where that wound would be, and there's about three of these photos, color and black and white. Uh, right in the middle on every one of the back of the head photos, with the without the big occipital gaping wound that the Parkland doctors all saw. Uh, he says right in the middle of that, it was two dimensional on every single photo. Somebody had in the darkroom had uh, uh, created a mask of some kind to uh, hide the gaping hole. Uh, the there is one photo or a pair of photos that do show a gaping hole. These were done, uh, and it's hard to see what you're looking at. These were done after the brain had been removed,
Hmm.
and you can see it's a big hole in and some with some bones kind of off centered and blasted out, whatnot. Uh, the pathologist who worked for the HSCA said that was a hole in the above the forehead of Kennedy. a hole that the Parkland people never saw. And, um, and Mantic looked at it and went to the archives, and he says, they're wrong. Uh, the what everybody's looking at is a cropped version of those photos. If you look at the originals, you can tell based on the rest of the other parts of the body, you can see that gaping hole that you're looking at is in the posterior, the back right of Kennedy's head, just like the Parkland doctors describe it. And it's labeled posterior uh, as part of the posterior of the skull. And Dr. Fink wrote a report in 1965 to General Blumberg about his participation in the autopsy. And he describes, find it. He also describes numerous metallic fragments in the head. Uh,
Are you cutting out or are you looking for it?
Now I'm looking for it.
Okay.
He describes, either in this report or in testimony, he described uh, assisting the photographer to take a picture of a hole, a gaping hole in the skull, and from both the inside and outside, both sides of that hole uh, in the posterior skull. He forgot he wasn't supposed to talk about the hole in the back of the head. And it's labeled posterior uh, in the list of exhibits.
Okay.
So one other X-ray has some problems, and both Dr. Mantic and Dr. Chesser. By the way, Dr. Chesser and Mantic agree there were 3 shots to Kennedy's head. One, as the autopsy pathologist described, that came in lower occipital, uh, straight on from the back. The second, being a oblique uh, shot, came in near the temple, near the right ear, and out uh, in the big hole.
You can
And
see
then,
that on the Zapruder film. You can see that
yeah,
shot.
yeah. And then the third, and by the way, uh, one thing you can't see on the Zapruder film is the hole in the back of the head, because it's either covered with a shadow or with a patch. Some say it's a patch, others say it's just a shadow.
Hmm.
But there's one frame 347, where if you blow it up, you can see uh, a sliver of what looks like brain material right behind his right ear. Uh, and then And then the third shot would be a shot that came in his top of his forehead, right at the hairline above his right eyebrow, and did not exit, but left behind that Milky Way or the snowstorm of uh, of fragments that seemed to disappear somehow. And the reason they disappeared before the brain autopsy is, there were 2 brain exams, and as evidence of that, you've uh, the ARRB investigators took the deposition of the photographer, uh, Stringer. He was he he was the probably head of his class in terms of medical photography. He taught at the med school there. He taught uh, uh, classes. He was renowned uh, for being the best, and he photographed the autopsy, and he photographed the, um, and he described being directed by Fink on taking this gaping hole of the skull, both inside and out of the skull. He also photographed the brain exam, and he said the exam he photographed happened 3 or 4 days after the assassination, either the Monday morning of the funeral or the next day. He's not sure. But Dr. Fink wasn't there, he said. Only Humes and Boswell were there, and he was there. And he said they did sections of the brain at that time. And he took photos of the sections, each one labeled, that he prepared the labels. Um, he did not take a photo of the brain from underneath, a basilar view. He did take it from the side and from above. Uh, and they showed him the photos in the archives of the brain. And he said, "That's not the brain I photographed." And they looked at the negatives and he said, "And I didn't take these pictures. That's not the film I use. I use for color Kodachrome, Kodak Ektachrome E3 process. And for black and white, I used Kodak Pan X film. And these pictures are not made with those films. They're made with Ansco. I never used Ansco. Ansco later became 3M.
Mm.
And as a photographer, kind of amateur slash semi pro photographer for 50 years, I can I will tell you personal experience. I know what film I used 50 years ago. Uh, this guy who taught classes also knew. And he said, basically, they did a second exam with a different brain because once you section a brain, it's useless. You can't do any more exams with it. Uh, and brought in a different photographer using different film. And that's what's in the archives. The,
Okay.
the, the pictures he took disappeared. Um, the Finally, the X-rays, Dr. Mantic and his and uh, a what I think Dr. Chesser is. I forget what his specialty is. He's from Arkansas. Mantic came up with a optical density test. There was two problems with the X-rays that he uh, he found. One on on a X-ray taken front to back of the skull, you can see right around midpoint back of the head. There appears to be a cross section of a 6.5 millimeter bullet. It's a perfect cross section of a bullet the size of which would have come from Oswald's rifle. The problem is one of the main objects of the autopsy, the thing that they were most focused on, was finding all the bullets. And nobody the night of the autopsy saw this on the x-ray. Even Humes, Boswell, and Fink, all of them said, "I don't remember seeing that."
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Mantic did some tests. Mantic replicated that with a skull that he owns. He said, "What you do is you just tape a bullet to the back, and it comes out looking exactly like this cross section." Uh, it could not have been a cross section because the nose of a piece of the nose of the bullet was found in the front seat of the limo, and a piece of the base of the bullet was found in the front seat of the limo. So, but you've got this cross section of the bullet that hung up on the outside of the back of the skull, which, by the way, was not visible uh, on the lateral view, the side view of the skull. Uh, but it was that particular X-ray that the HSCA used as the basis for moving the entrance hole, bullet hole, uh, that the pathologist in Bethesda found, moving that up 4 inches, 4 inches higher up, which was where that cross-section bullet appeared on the X-ray. Well, using optical density measurements, he found that it was impossible for that bullet to be, or that cross section to be naturally there. It would have been too long. It would have shown up on the lateral skull. So he concluded it was late. It was added later, just like he did when he replicated it.
Okay.
And then he wonders what happened to the big hole in the back of the head. Why doesn't that appear? It should appear on the lateral, uh, towards the rear of the skull, but all you see there is a bright white place. There's a big section on the back rear of the lateral X-ray where the skull appears whiter than anywhere else. He calls it a white patch. Using again optical density measurements, and here he went back. He found a baseline skull X-rays uh, of Kennedy's skull from 1960 in the Kennedy Library in Massachusetts. They had some the original skull X-rays back from 1960. Not manipulated in any way. So he did OD measurements on that. Then he did OD measurements on the original X-rays in the archives and concluded that through post uh, processing darkroom work, somebody has altered the X-ray by superimposing a white spot, that it is magnitude greater than you would see on any normal X-ray, and even within that X-ray, uh, it, it 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 gives the appearance on the X-ray of a bone that is hundreds of times thicker than one of the uh, hardest, thickest bones in the head, a bone that goes across around ear level or so. Uh, these this So he has concluded that that X-ray has been uh, altered by somebody. Chesser replicated that study and agrees with him. Uh,
Okay. So you've told us about all the problems with the various inconsistencies. Is there any others before I
um,
ask my question here?
yeah, the witness. Yeah, what happened with the HSCA? Uh, HSCA did not quarrel with what the uh, original autopsy said because it was supported by the X-rays and photographs in the record, and we're going to disregard what the Parkland doctors
Mm.
said, including a nurse. One nurse came in and said, "Where's the wound?" and a doctor lifted up his head. She's testified to this. Lifted up his head, turned the head to the left, and showed him what was where the wound was. Without him doing that, she didn't see a wound in his head.
Mm.
Another nurse uh, signed a statement on November 22nd saying that she was told by the doctors to get a dressing and try to stop some of the bleeding coming out of his head. And she said the wound in the back of the head was just too big. I couldn't.
Hmm.
It didn't work.
Right. That wasn't effective. Okay.
Um, so, despite the fact that you're talking about highly credentialed, well experienced people doctors who deal in the ER with head wounds, gunshot wounds, like on a regular basis, uh, from a big city, Dallas, uh, one of the premier hospitals and emergency rooms in the state. Uh, we're going to ignore what all of them said because we can see the x-rays and photos and it doesn't show a big wound that they're talking about. And every witness we talked to who was at the autopsy said, you know, described what they saw as being consistent with the autopsy pathologist, what their report said. Well, the ARRB talked to those people who were at the autopsy, and basically the HSCA lied because witness after witness after witness described the big gaping hole in the back of his head, just like the Parkland people said, described the what I've given you a taste of, including the two FBI guys with their 302, and plus the evidence of surgery on the head that didn't happen at Parkland. You'll see in the links that you've put out, you can see evidence of the surgery. There's a shot from the side of Kennedy where you can see a V shaped incision up on the top of his forehead at the hairline, exactly where some of the witnesses described seeing uh, x-rays or photos of a bullet hole where Mantic and Chesser say there was evidence on the x-rays of a bullet going through his forehead and causing that fragment trail across the head.
Okay. So let me ask you a couple questions then. How many bullets do you think struck Kennedy? Oh, you muted yourself.
I see that. Yeah, I'm with Mantic and Chesser. One thing to add, the witnesses also described watching Dr. Fink try to probe
Mm-hmm.
back wounds, um, and photographs were taken of those probes.
Hmm.
They've disappeared.
The photographs or the probe?
The photographs.
Okay.
So uh, photographs of the probes, because they show that the back room wound was a back wound. It didn't go up to the throat.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's some supposition without hard proof that they had created a second back wound at the base of his neck that you could, through force, uh, uh, make come out of the throat. Uh, One witness, a Lieutenant Lipsy, who was the aide to General Wheel, who was in charge of the Washington, D.C. area of the Army. Lipsy sat through the autopsy And he said towards the end, after they talked to the Dr. Perry, that that they concluded there were three wounds, one to his head, one to the back of his neck that came out his throat, and a third one to his upper back, uh, 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 shoulder level. Uh, so, uh, so the conclusions by the pathologist seemed to be a moving target, because by the next morning they had apparently heard about the shot that missed, so they had to drop one. They dropped the one in the back,
Mm.
and they kept the one in the base of the neck as the entry for the shot that came out, uh, and 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 they got there because they talked to Dr. Perry, who had made the tracheotomy.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Uh,
Incisions.
and, and Perry and others at Parkland said he made that incision over the bullet hole.
Mm-hmm.
But what the bullet hole looked like was an entry wound. It was, the edges weren't ragged. They weren't curved out
Mm.
or anything. It looked like an entrance wound to
To
him.
him. Okay.
Well, they
So.
called Perry and threatened to take him to the medical board, because Perry did not know about any wound to the back, because they had not turned the body over. So he couldn't conclude, they told him, that it was an entrance wound, and if you don't change your opinion, we're going to report you and have your license
Mm.
jerked.
Fantastic.
That's what the,
Yeah.
huh?
Fantastic.
uh, yeah.
Okay. So if I
And and
understood
and
you
and and
correctly,
and one more.
okay.
The later, 3 days later, Secret Service sent a an agent from the West Coast in by the name of Elmer Moore. He was charged with not only investigating the uh, Ruby's killing of Oswald,
Mm.
but the main thing he was sent to do was to pressure the Parkland doctors into not saying there was exit wound in the back, and an entry wound in the front,
Right, because that
which
would
he
have been
did,
inconsistent. Okay.
which he did.
So if I'm following you, you think that he was struck by three bullets. Yes?
He was struck by three bullets to the head. He plus the one in the back, plus the one in the front. That makes five. He ran into a crossfire.
Okay. That's why I asked, because it wasn't clear to me how many you thought it was. Okay. So if that's true, then the question becomes the medical evidence would need to be altered if it's five, but that doesn't make sense that it's one shooter then. You would have to monkey with the medical evidence in order to resolve that discrepancy. Um, but how do you get the doctors to agree to do that? What do you think? Because you're implying without stating that there was a conspiracy, some people were involved. They're covering up the fact that it's not just Oswald, and they're doing that by altering the medical documentation. So,
There are two agencies involved here: Secret Service, which walked off with all of the bullet fragment
bullet
evidence,
fragments, yeah.
and the photographs as well. I don't know who altered the X-rays, but the radiologist, who also saw the big gaping hole in the back of the head, uh, he he was having his technicians do some X-rays of the skull with bullet fragments or some bone fragments taped to the back of the skull. So he was kind of, sounds like, seeing if it was doable to do what they did with the cross section of the bullet. All right, you asked me
To
why.
alter the documentary proof that
Yeah,
was being relied on.
yeah.
Right, I'm with you there. Okay, so
On the why, you have to understand a little bit more about the military's possible motivation to be involved in this.
okay, so before we do that, let me ask you. You're not implying or suggesting that any of the doctors at Parkland were involved.
No,
Right.
but they're under orders, and you remember there was a um, there the what I'll call the cover story was we can't have anybody but Oswald being the shooter, and Oswald quote the lone nut. Because it might lead to World War III. This could be the Russians and the Cubans. So we're gonna brush that or sweep that under the rug. That would be the story that they might use to justify the orders. But they were not in charge of this autopsy, and Dr. Fink testified as much in the in Jim Garrison's trial of Clay Shaw in New Orleans a few years later. Uh, he wanted to dissect the neck wound, and an army general told him no, and he followed orders. Uh, it's the plus you have the fact that everybody involved in this was under strict orders not to talk about it, which they did not.
Okay, but you've got in the room alone, you've got Secret Service, FBI, and at least two different branches of the military, right?
Okay, yeah, you had three: uh, Air Force, Army, and Navy.
Okay, plus the Secret Service and the FBI.
Okay, Secret Service was in on it. The agents clearly were in on it because they walked off with the vials full of all these fragments that disappeared, and they walked off with the unprocessed photographs. They had a processing lab that they used, so they were in charge of processing the photos and deciding what to keep. Then you had,
Well, wait,
you
wait,
know,
wait. So let's stick with them. So the agents that were involved in the autopsy, were they from Kennedy's detail or were they from the White House?
both, both.
Okay.
Let me tell you about the Army.
Okay.
Have you heard of the Operation Northwoods?
Yes, but I don't remember what it's about.
It was a proposal by the Joint Chiefs of Staff uh, with support from the CIA that the best way to deal with Cuba was to create a false flag operation and blame it on Cuba. Sink a ship, uh, shoot down a drone commercial airliner, uh, near Cuba, uh, have a terrorist uh, activity in the United States somewhere, and do it so that we can blame Cuba, which will give us an excuse to go invade or bomb.
Okay.
And that was a proposal they made, I think, after. They certainly renewed the proposal if they made it before, but after the Cuban Missile Crisis, uh, they never withdrew it. Kennedy threw it in the trash,
Right.
walked out of the room.
But he wouldn't go along with that,
He
right?
wouldn't go along with it. But one way to look at the assassination is a false flag, because at the as soon as the assassination took place on Friday, by the next day, a group of Cuban student activists being run by the CIA called they were members of the DRA. They were the same group that Oswald had a altercation with when he was handing out free play for Cuba pamphlets in New Orleans a couple of months earlier. Uh, at that time, the CIA was running and paying for a group of young Cuban men who were being trained, also with the help of the CIA, in paramilitary training and uh, also for propaganda purposes. Right after the assassination, a bunch of those of that group started putting out propaganda blaming the assassination on Castro, tying Oswald to Cuba and telling the world that it was all done by Castro. Uh,
Right. Okay. So they're either taking advantage of the situation, or if you wanted to say it's a false flag, so you got to have somebody who claims the flag, right? Who
co-
says, "I saw these guys." This is what the Germans did to Poland. Oh yeah, the Poles attacked us first. Uh huh. Sure they did. Well, they were wearing Polish uniforms. Yeah, your guys dressed in Polish uniforms that you shot. Uh huh. Sure. So somebody has to set up the hue and cry and say this happened. So, okay, that
the other thing is, you remember the JFK movie?
yes,
You remember the Sutherland character, X?
no, it's been too
The
long since I've seen it. So yeah.
he was he played. You ought to watch it again. He played a military intelligence person who refused to give the Garrison, the played by Kevin Costner, uh, his name. He said, "Just call me
Mm,
X." He's the one. Met him in the mall at the mall in D.C. Sat on a bench and gave him some kind of insight as to things that had happened uh, just before the assassination. He said he got sent to uh, the Arctic or Alaska or somewhere. He said the major members of the cabinet got sent to Hawaii to have a meeting in Hawaii, so they wouldn't be in D.C. The power got turned off, or the telephone lines got turned off, or something in D.C. He said, and this was the big one. He said the uh, Army Intelligence Unit 114 out of Fort Worth, they should have been available, thought they were going to be available to help provide security for the presidential motorcade and put people on roofs, make sure there are no open windows in high buildings along the motorcade route. He said they got a stand down order just before the assassination. And by the way, and uh, that Sullivan character, he sort of his purpose, his role in the
mm,
movie was kind of tie
yeah,
together the big
make it
picture.
make sense. Yeah,
He's based on a real person.
yeah.
His name is Fletcher Prouty, who's written some books. Some of them are kind of far
Mm,
out, but everything that came out of Sutherland's mouth, Prouty has espoused also. And Jim DiEugenia, who's one of he's the historian who has written some of the movies for Oliver Stone. And who testified in Congress. He is on record saying he got a call from the daughter of one of the officers of uh, Unit 114 out of Fort Worth that a handful of them showed up at her family's home the morning after the assassination, all upset. And they were talking unguardedly, confirming, you know, they had been told to stand down, just as the Sullivan character said in the movie.
Okay,
Uh,
so but we were talking about the who in the autopsy room would have to be either involved or accounted for, including the doctors.
the
So
doctors were under orders. That's one. So, and there were high up people, including the Surgeon General of the Navy and somebody equivalent for the Army, I think, as well. Uh, it to me it sounded like a military operation because you had the casket thing alone. There were to back up what I say. There are two after action reports. One by the officer in charge of the Joint Casket Team, the ones in formal uniform, uh, who described bringing the ornate casket in with the body in it at 8 o'clock, and a second one by Sergeant Boyjan, who was a Marine sergeant who put together a Marine detail out of D.C. to provide security. And his report says they brought the body in at 6:35, and this that part of the story was verified by reporters back in 1981 who interviewed, uh, I think, 3 soldiers who were involved in that casket entry. What they did is they brought him in early, flew him there by helicopter, landed a helicopter in the officers back of the officers parking lot at Bethesda, uh, put the casket into a black Cadillac hearse, drove it to the back of the hospital, offloaded it, took it into the morgue, did their X-rays, and pre-autopsy surgery. Then, uh, in the meantime, the empty ornate casket had arrived. They put the body back in it, put it into one of the gray Navy ambulances, and hooked up with the formal casket team and brought it in the second time. Uh, that's the only explanation for what happened. Uh, and Doug Horn, earlier this week, published on YouTube his the all of the evidence he's been able to compile to support that.
so for people who don't
No.
know, tell them who Doug Horn is, because he is a
Doug
super
Horn
interesting
was the
guy.
the lead medical investigator for the Assassination Review Board in the late 1990s, and smart guy,
Yeah.
ex-Navy, retired Navy, but he has pieced it all together and has written a what I call the go-to source on all things medical, uh, and JFK in a 5-volume treatise on the autopsy and everything else medical related.
And he was he the chief of the board?
No, he was the chief investigator
Right. That's what
for the
that
medical part of it.
right. And so he
And
had access to the archives and all the files. So he's
right,
not like some dude, who's over time just collected stuff off the internet. No, he was dealing with the actual documents.
and the actual witnesses,
Right. Yeah.
most of whom are dead now.
Right.
But
As
but he
part
was
of the
taught
government's official review that they did in the 90s.
right,
And so
yeah,
yeah, he's a credible source for sure.
and he's the one who discovered he probably the first one to discover that the HSCA just flat out lied about what the autopsy witnesses had told the
Right.
HSCA.
And so for people who are, not following this, HSCA is what again? What does it stand
It's the House Select Committee on Assassinations.
Right, which is
They
an earlier attempted
That
review.
was it. Yeah,
Yeah,
the 1975, 76,
yeah, 76.
something like that.
Yeah,
And they not only looked at JFK, they looked at Martin Luther King
right,
and Bobby Kennedy.
right. So that's, 10 dozen years later, and then the board, the AARB, that comes along
They're the ones that,
25
yeah,
years later after that.
it's the board's report that got Congress to finally release the JFK records. Uh, the HSCA sealed all the autopsy records for 50 years.
Mhm.
They said, one, we believe what the Warren Commission and its pathologists did, uh, but because everybody who was there in Bethesda agrees with it, and just, but we won't let anybody see it for 50 years. So the cover up continued a long time.
All right,
But
so
back to why military. I
yeah,
think there's a cabal in the military consisting chiefly of the Joint Chiefs that didn't want to leave Vietnam. They wanted to ramp up uh, that war. They wanted to invade Cuba. They thought Kennedy was a traitor because he was trying to backchannel a détente with Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, and he was reaching out and starting the same process with Castro.
see, it doesn't have to be that though, right? They could have decided they just didn't want to panic the public, and rather than saying three guys gunned down the president in broad daylight, we're going to say it's this one loner dude, and so the evidence has to align with that.
Back up.
Yeah,
Oswald was alive. You're talking about evidence that's
yeah,
going to come into a criminal trial
yeah.
with the prosecutor seeking the death sentence. A legitimate professional, knowing that is going on, would say no unless something else is going on. It's not a public perception thing. Autopsies aren't public. You never
Right.
see, until there's a trial, you don't see autopsies. Public doesn't ever see what goes on. Rarely, sometimes you don't even learn what the findings are. So we're talking about
So you're saying,
obstruction of
without
justice.
saying, you're saying they would have had a plan already to kill Oswald, figuring that this autopsy is never going to see the light of day in a courtroom.
Correct. And otherwise, they could be facing the death sentence. They could be charged by the DA in Dallas if any of it came out, what they did of tampering with evidence, being part of a conspiracy to kill the president. Their necks were on the line. You don't do that just to protect the sensitivity of the public.
But see,
That's not
I can't believe any of this. I really cannot, because I can't believe that in this short amount of time between him being shot and this happening, that they have arranged all of this and threatened, coerced, whatever, these military doctors into falsifying their autopsy report.
it didn't stop there. There were people
I don't think it
that,
started there, but who
eh,
who exactly do you think is doing that?
I think it goes all the way to the top, chain of command.
So Johnson wants it to be the one shooter theory. You're saying he
Correct.
effectively issued
This
Oswald's death warrant by saying that.
I don't think any of this could have happened without his knowledge. And I think it did happen. I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming that it did happen.
Okay, so but I'm playing devil's advocate here, although as I said at the beginning, I have trouble with any of this conspiracy. But all right, so let's say even if Johnson isn't personally like, all right, this is dudes, this is what I want you to do. Even if he does the Henry, what was it, Henry V, will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest routine. Even if he says, I want the public to think this is a one guy scenario. General, whatever your name is here, you go forth and make that happen. It's an awful lot of coordination in a few hours.
Coordination and fast on your feet alteration of plans, because nobody anticipated that Jackie would want to ride with the body in the ambulance. The body, the casket at that time had to be empty, uh, and stored away in the luggage compartment of Air Force One. That probably happened uh, when everybody was attending the swearing in ceremony. But there are too many irregularities and actually criminal conduct described by witnesses to the autopsy and documented with what we see today: an X-ray showing fragments of a bullet going through the top of his head that bear no relationship to the path of the bullet described by the pathologist. They just ignored it. Uh, a witnesses describing Humes saying they're counting out at least 40 fragments in the brain and trying to pull as many as he could out with forceps, and then those disappearing and not mentioned anywhere in the autopsy report. Uh, Both, Fink and Humes, in their testimony, described uh, the difference between a frangible bullet that
Mm.
that fragments upon hitting something hard versus a full metal jacketed bullet that doesn't do that. These fragments running through the brain uh, clearly are not don't represent a full metal jacketed bullet. They're classic evidence of a like a hunting round that hits and goes into the body of whoever you're trying to shoot. So there's just it's and the Parkland doctors. There's a movie that were made about them around, forget when it came out, 2016, 18, I forget when, uh, in which those that are still around talk and explain what they saw, and uh, and what they saw, they documented how any pathologist who's not crooked fails to mention uh, that wound in the back of his head that they described, and as the nurse said, tried to stop the bleeding from. Uh, and then finally, there's the to me the linchpin of it all is the cerebellum. The photos of the brain in the archives, the cerebellum is intact and undamaged. But you've got doctor after doctor after doctor in Dallas watching the cerebellum fall out of the head onto the stretcher and looking down and see a vacant space where it used to be. Now, you can't reconcile those two things.
Well, I don't disagree that they might not have monkeyed around with the findings, right? Um,
Then explain
Either intentionally
explain why
or because of the
what that is,
stress. Yeah.
what I just described is witness is tampering with evidence, obstruction of justice, a cover up that could get them indicted in Dallas and possibly tried with Oswald as a accessory after the fact.
I actually don't think military doctors up here would have worried about that in 1963. That they would get hauled down to Dallas for to be put on trial. The one fact that is always caused me to wonder if there was a conspiracy is Ruby's killing of Oswald. That's the
Yep.
only fact that persuades me that there's a problem.
Um, oh, there's more. I, I'm just
Okay.
starting. I'm
All
just
right.
starting.
Well,
There's a lot more. Um,
so we've been going for 2.5 hours almost. So we're gonna have to
yeah.
wind up here for today. But the autopsy that was used for the Warren Commission, um, did they have at that, like this 302 that you're talking about, or is that material that has been released in this new
Yeah.
release that the government that Trump put out?
No, the Warren Commission never saw that.
Right.
They never saw the photos. They never saw the X-rays. They weren't interested. They had the report, the written report that I read part of it, and they
Hmm.
had the testimony
Right.
of the doctors. They also had testimonies of two or three of the Parkland doctors.
Well, that's what I was going to
Um,
ask you. Did they not try to reconcile that? I can't remember what they said.
did not. They just went with the autopsy doctors.
Findings.
Uh,
Okay.
and the lawyer for the Warren Commission, Arlen Specter.
Mm.
I don't have it here in front of me, but he on the back wound versus neck wound, as whether it was and the throat wound, whether it was an entrance wound like the Parkland doctors thought it was, or an exit wound. Uh, Specter asked a question. I'm paraphrasing. Uh, assume hypothetically, assume that uh, a bullet came in, a bullet was shot from behind, entered at the base of the neck, came out through the throat right below the Adam's apple, and didn't hit anything hard going in or coming out. Uh, would would that, if you assume those facts was what you saw, might that be consistent with those facts? And the answer was yeah. If you assume
Yeah.
the answer, yeah, it is. But he never asked them what did you see? Describe what you saw, and what is your opinion as to whether it's entrance wound or an exit wound? It was a lawyer's trick, and he asked the same question of all the doctors from Parkland who did testify and got the same answer. Yes, possible if, under those assumptions.
Right. Well, Arlen Specter was a very good lawyer. Um, so he people may not know that he was a senator, but he was a U.S. attorney. He was a very good in the courtroom lawyer, actually, and so I'm not surprised at all if he was putting together
But
questions.
the magic bullet, by the
Hmm.
way, um, it has come out since that uh, it's likely was planted
by
Secret
by
Service,
Secret Service.
and I can give you that now if you got about 5 minutes.
Okay, we'll do that, and
Otherwise,
then we'll wrap up for today.
okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the chain of custody goes like this. There was a maintenance man at the hospital by the name of Tomlinson who was who opened the elevator that went up to the second floor. Connolly was on the second floor getting in surgery, and the stretcher that they took him up to the second floor appears to have been left in the elevator. So Tomlinson is moving that that stretcher out of the elevator and puts it up against the wall in the hallway near the emergency room on the first floor. At that time, somebody's coming out the bathroom, and and there was a second stretcher in the way that had some bloody uh, dressing on it and a stethoscope. Tomlinson moved that away from the bathroom door, pushed it up against the wall, and a bullet was exposed. He said it came out, fell on the floor or something. He went and got his supervisor by the name of O.P. Wright, who took the bullet, gave it to a Secret Service agent who who put in his envelope, took it to Washington D.C. on Air Force One. He gave it to um, the director of the Secret Service, Rowley, who that night gave it to the FBI to go do lab work on it. Um, the only documentation for that was the last part. The three FBI agents who handled it put their initials on it. And there was a written receipt from Rowley to the FBI agent. So they didn't have documentation of the first part of finding the bullet and giving it to the Secret Service guy. Uh, a month or two later, a FBI memo was created where it was described that an agent by the name of Bardwell Odom, that's an agent from Texas, uh, had had taken the bullet or a picture of it, shown it to everybody in the chain, and gotten vague answers from everybody. Nobody could, except for the ones who put their initials on it, nobody could uh, say for sure it was the same one that they handled, but it's similar. And they put that memo in the file.
So there you go.
There you go.
Documented.
But
Right.
I'm not done. They when the records were finally opened up, a author by the name of Josiah Thompson and a medical doctor by the name of Dr. Gary Aguilar found the memo, and they say this is weird. So they went to look for Bardwell Odom's 302 that he would have filled
Mhm.
out when he went and talked to the two Parkland employees. And there was no 302 in the file, no 302 in the uh, records, the archives. So they tried to track down Bardwell Odom. No, but first they tracked down Tomlinson and O.P. Wright. They couldn't find Tomlinson, but they found O.P. Wright.
Mhm.
He says they showed him the bullet. He says that's not the bullet
when,
I
when was
saw.
this?
This was several years
Mhm.
later. He says, well, what the bullet like that you saw look like? He pulled one out of his desk drawer, and a hunting bullet with a pointed top, one of those soft point bullets that I described,
Mhm.
with a point on it. The uh, Oswald gun bullet, it has a round front instead of pointed. And he said it looked like this. He says. So then they tracked down Bardwell Odom, and he says I never showed that bullet to those guys. This memo's wrong. He said, if I had gone and done that, I would have done a 302. Said, and so somebody at the FBI made it up.
Good grief. Close enough for government work. All right. Okay. So I think that's enough for today. That's the autopsy sort of angle on the case. What do you propose to talk about next time? Can we give folks a
Y-
preview?
yeah, next time I'd like to get into Oswald and some what appears to be. Well, you got the issue of one. What was Oswald's connection to the CIA, if any? And there were strange things going on leading up to the assassination involving what I will refer to as Oswald impersonators and an Oswald doppelganger.
Right. We alluded to that the first time when we were highlighting sort of
Right.
issues. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, good. That sounds great. So we will convene about what is a good time for the third installation. And
Yeah.
we had envisioned this originally as 3 conversations. It's clear to me it's going to be more like 5 or 6 or 7. So we'll just keep going.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, my friend. And we'll
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
good night to everyone. See you guys next time.
Okay. Okay.
Bye.
Bye bye.